The wind howled like a wounded animal through the narrow streets of Dustmere, driving sheets of freezing rain against the weathered buildings. Clara Langley stood at the edge of the platform, her traveling dress already soaked through, the dark fabric clinging to her frame like a second skin. She clutched her valise with both hands, knuckles white beneath her sodden gloves. As she searched the empty street for any sign of Harold Dunn, he had promised to meet her. His letters, written in careful script on fine paper, had painted pictures of a prosperous life in the timber trade, of a house with proper glass windows and a parlor stove that never went cold. After the disaster in Philadelphia, after James Hartford had publicly withdrawn his proposal, declaring her too spirited for a proper wife, those letters had seemed like salvation. Clara pulled her shawl tighter, though it offered little protection against the storm. The train conductor had warned her about traveling in February, but she'd had no choice. Her aunt had made it clear that her welcome was worn thin, and the gossips of Society Hill had ensured no respectable family would receive her. Too independent, they whispered, too outspoken. A woman who dared to voice opinions on matters beyond household management and social calls. The mud sucked at her boots as she made her way down Main Street, dragging her valise through the mire. Dustmere was nothing like Harold's descriptions. The buildings leaned against each other like drunken men, their unpainted boards gray with age and weather. Signs creaked on rusted chains: Milligan's Dry Goods, the Lucky Strike Saloon, Dunn Timber Company. She found his office above the Mercantile, reached by a narrow staircase that groaned under her weight. Through the door, she could hear voices, Harold's familiar tenor and several others, punctuated by bursts of laughter. Clara knocked, water dripping from her bonnet onto the warped floorboards. The voices stopped. Footsteps approached, and the door swung open to reveal Harold Dunn. He was smaller than she'd imagined, with thinning hair pomaded flat against his skull and a mustache waxed to sharp points. His eyes, which had seemed warm in his photograph, now regarded her with something between surprise and annoyance. "Miss Langley." He didn't move aside to let her in. Behind him, she could see other men business associates, by their dress watching with undisguised curiosity. Mr. Dunn." She tried to smile, though her teeth were chattering. "I sent word of my arrival. The weather delayed the train, but—" "Yes, about that." He glanced back at his companions, then stepped into the hallway, pulling the door nearly closed behind him. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding." Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. "A misunderstanding?" "When we corresponded, I was under the impression—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "That is, I believed you to be a different sort of woman, someone more suitable to the demands of frontier life." "I don't understand. My letters were quite clear about—" "Your letters revealed a woman of strong opinions, Miss Langley. Too strong, perhaps. And then I received word from Philadelphia." His lips pursed beneath the mustache. "About the Hartford situation, about your reputation." Heat flooded Clara's cheeks despite the cold. "My reputation is intact, Mr. Dunn. James Hartford is a small-minded man who couldn't tolerate a woman with thoughts of her own." "Precisely my point." Harold's voice hardened. "I need a wife, Miss Langley. Not a competitor, not someone who'll question every business decision or embarrass me in front of associates with talk of voting rights and reform. The frontier requires women who understand their place." The door opened wider, and one of the men inside called out, "Harold, you're coming back! This whiskey won't drink itself!" Laughter erupted from within. Harold's face reddened. "You should find lodging for the night. The morning stage runs back east. I'll pay your passage." "Of course. It's the least I can do." He retreated into the office without waiting for a response, the door clicking shut with awful finality. Clara stood in the dim hallway, rain drumming on the roof above, her whole body shaking now from cold and humiliation. From inside came more laughter, and she caught Harold's voice. Thought she'd make a proper frontier wife. Can you imagine? She descended the stairs on unsteady legs, her wet skirts tangling around her ankles. Outside, the storm had worsened, sleet mixed with the rain, stinging her face like tiny needles. Across the street, light spilled from the Lucky Strike saloon, and she could see faces pressed against the windows, watching her struggle through the mud. Someone must have spread word already, Harold Dunn's mail-order bride, rejected on arrival. Clara had never felt so alone. No money for lodging, no family to return to, no prospects ahead or behind. She dragged her valise toward the only other lit building. She could see a church at the end of the street, its modest steeple barely visible through the driving storm. Her strength gave out at the bottom of the church steps. The valise slipped from her numb fingers, and she sank onto the lowest step, uncaring that the wood was slick with ice. What did it matter now? Let the good people of Dustmere find her frozen corpse in the morning. It would give them something to gossip about besides Harold Dunn's good sense in refusing her. "Ma'am." The voice came from above. Clara looked up to see a man standing beneath the church's covered entrance, silhouetted against the lamplight from within. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a buffalo coat that had seen better days. "Ma'am, you can't stay out here. Storm's getting worse." She tried to answer, but her teeth were chattering too hard to form words. The man descended the steps, and she could see his face, now weathered and sun-browned even in winter, with dark eyes that held no pity, only concern. "There's a stable round back," he said. "Been cleaned out. Got a stove going. It's warm and dry." Clara found her voice. I have no money for—" "Didn't ask for any." He picked up her valise as if it weighed nothing. "Name's Luke Rawlins. I keep horses there sometimes. Right now it's empty except for my mare. You can bed down in the tack room." She should refuse. A proper lady didn't accept such offers from strange men. But then again, a proper lady wouldn't be sitting in a freezing storm, abandoned and humiliated. And there was something in his manner direct, matter-of-fact, that suggested he offered help because it was needed. Nothing more. Clara let him help her to her feet. Her legs nearly buckled, but he steadied her with a hand on her elbow, careful not to presume more contact than necessary. "Thank you," she managed through chattering teeth. He just nodded and led the way around the church. His long stride shortened to match her stumbling steps. The stable materialized from the darkness, a modest building but solid, with walls that blocked the worst of the wind. Inside, a pot-bellied stove glowed cherry red, and the air smelled of hay and horses and blessed warmth. Luke set her valise down near the stove. "There's blankets in that chest. I'll fetch some food from the parsonage. Reverend's wife always has something on the stove." He turned to go, then paused at the door. "Whatever brought you to Dustmere in this weather, it must have seemed important. Sometimes what seems like an ending is really a beginning. Just got to survive the storm first." Then he was gone, leaving Clara alone with the warmth and the soft nickering of a horse in the far stall. She sank onto a wooden bench near the stove, steam beginning to rise from her soaked clothes. For the first time since stepping off the train, she allowed herself to cry, not from self-pity, but from relief at this unexpected kindness in a night that had seemed determined to break her. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the stable, Clara Langley began to thaw. Luke Rawlins stood beneath the church's entrance, watching the woman struggle with her valise through the storm. He'd been waiting for the Reverend to finish his evening prayers when he'd heard the commotion from Dunn's office voices carrying clear across the street despite the wind. Harold Dunn's cruelty didn't surprise him. Little in Dustmere did any more. The woman looked near collapse when he'd called out to her. Pride had kept her spine straight even as her body shook with cold, and that had decided him. Pride like that deserved respect, not pity. Now, walking back from the parsonage with a covered pot of stew and half a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, Luke wondered what had possessed her to travel to Dustmere in February. Harold's mail-order bride, that's what the gossips would call her by morning. Another desperate woman taken in by promises that turned to smoke at first sight. He pushed open the stable door to find her still on the bench, though she'd managed to remove her soaked bonnet and gloves. Her dark hair hung in wet strands around her face, and her eyes, brown as autumn leaves, watched him with wary gratitude.
"Mrs. Caldwell's rabbit stew,"
he said, setting the pot on a small table near the stove.
"She makes enough to feed half the county."
"Please thank her for me. Mr. Rollins." Her voice was steadier now, educated and careful. "I'll repay her kindness when I can." Luke found 2 tin bowls and spoons on a shelf, remnants from when he'd lived in the stable himself that first winter after leaving the cavalry. He ladled out the stew, noting how her hands trembled as she accepted the bowl from cold or nerves. He couldn't say. They ate in silence for a moment before she spoke again. "You were watching from the church?" "Waiting for Reverend Morse. I help with repairs sometimes." He tore the bread in half, offering her the larger piece. "Sound carries in this town. Harold Dunn's voice especially." Color touched her cheeks. "Then you heard—"
"Heard enough."
Luke kept his tone neutral.
"Harold's a fool, but that's his burden to bear, not yours."
She studied him over her bowl.
"You speak as though you know him well."
"Well enough. He tried to buy timber rights to land that wasn't his to claim. Shoshone territory. Though he figured dead Indians don't file property disputes." Luke's jaw tightened at the memory. "I disagreed."
"And the law?"
"The law looks the other way when there's profit involved. I made sure there wasn't any profit to be had." He met her gaze directly. "Some folks in town figure that makes me a troublemaker. Others just call me contrary." "And which are you?" "Both, probably." He gestured to her bowl. "Eat. You need the warmth." She complied, and they finished the meal without further conversation. Luke collected the bowls, wiping them clean with hay. When he turned back, she was struggling to stand, exhaustion clear in every line of her body. "The tack room's through there," he said, pointing to a door at the back of the stable. "Got a cot and blankets. Stovepipe runs through so it stays warm. There's a bar for the door from inside." "Mr. Rollins, She paused, seeming to search for words. "Why are you helping me? You don't know me. I could be exactly the difficult woman Harold Dunn described." Luke considered the question. "Maybe you are. Doesn't mean you deserve to freeze to death." He pulled on his buffalo coat. "My mare's in the last stall. Name's Buttercup, don't let the name fool you. She bites strangers. I'll check on you both in the morning." "You're not staying here." "Got a cabin about 2 miles north, close enough to town for work, far enough for peace." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "What you do tomorrow's your business. Miss Langley, Clara Langley." "Miss Langley, but if you're thinking of taking Harold's offer of passage back east, I'd reconsider. Running from one closed door usually just leads to another." She lifted her chin, that pride flashing again. "And what would you suggest instead?" "Depends. What skills do you have besides being too independent for Philadelphia society?" Her eyes narrowed, but he caught the hint of a smile. "I can read, write, and figure better than most men. I speak French and some German. I can sew anything from a christening gown to a sail, and I once helped my father keep books for his shipping concern before he died." "Then you've got more to offer than half the men in this town. Question is whether you're willing to fight for your place here. Fight whom the whole town already knows Harold rejected me. That's what makes it interesting." Luke opened the door, letting in a blast of cold air. "Harold Dunn just gave you something most folks never get: freedom from expectations. Nobody expects anything from the woman who wasn't good enough for Harold. Might be surprised what you can build from that kind of starting point." He left before she could respond, stepping back into the storm. The wind had picked up, driving ice crystals horizontal across the churchyard. As he unhitched his horse from the post behind the church, a rangy gelding named Samson, not the mare he'd warned her about, Luke wondered what had possessed him to offer advice to a stranger. Maybe it was the way she'd sat on those church steps, defeated but not broken. Or maybe it was knowing what it felt like to arrive somewhere with hope, only to have it torn away. He'd come to Dustmere wearing cavalry blues, believing he could serve both his country and justice. Instead, he'd found corruption wearing a badge and murder dressed up as progress. The cabin materialized from the darkness, a solid log structure he'd built with his own hands after leaving the fort. No glass windows, couldn't afford them, but the shutters were thick and the chinking was tight. Inside, he lit the oil lamp and stirred the banked coals in the fireplace back to life. As he settled into his narrow bed, Luke thought about Clara Langley in the stable tack room. By morning, word would be all over town. Harold's rejection would be embellished with each telling until she became either a fool or a Jezebel, depending on the storyteller's inclination. But there'd been steel in her spine when she'd talked about her skills, and intelligence in those brown eyes that suggested she understood the game even if she hadn't chosen to play it. Dustmere had a way of grinding people down, wearing away their edges until they fit into the shapes the town expected. Harold Dunn had arrived 5 years ago with grand plans and smooth manners, and now he was just another petty tyrant ruling over his small domain. The shopkeepers' wives who'd come west with dreams of adventure now gossiped behind their counters. Their world shrunk to the size of their parlors. But occasionally, someone refused to be worn down. Old Martha Washington, and yes, that was her real name, had arrived 40 years ago and built a laundry business that now employed half the Chinese families in town. Sam Lee had faced down threats and violence to establish his restaurant, and now even the most prejudiced ranchers admitted he made the best food in 3 counties. Maybe Clara Langley would join their ranks. Or maybe she'd be on the morning stage heading east. Another casualty of the frontier's false promises. Luke turned down the lamp and listened to the storm rage outside. Either way, he'd done what he could, given her shelter, food, and something to think about besides Harold Dunn's rejection. The rest was up to her. In the stable, 2 miles south, Clara Langley lay on the narrow cot in the tack room, wrapped in blankets that smelled of horses and leather. The stovepipe that ran through the wall radiated warmth, and for the first time in hours, she wasn't shivering. Luke Rawlins's words echoed in her mind, freedom from expectations. It was a strange way to look at public humiliation, but she had to admit there was truth in it. In Philadelphia, she'd been constrained by her father's reputation, her family's social standing, the narrow path laid out for women of her class. Here, rejected and scorned, she had nothing left to lose. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, for the first time since boarding the train west, Clara felt something like hope. The warmth of the stable wrapped around Clara like a blessing as she sat near the pot-bellied stove, her wet clothes finally beginning to dry. Luke Rawlins had left an hour ago, but his presence lingered in the careful way he'd arranged everything, the blankets folded on a wooden chest, the lamp positioned to cast light without creating shadows, the way he'd pointed out the bar for the door without making her feel threatened. She'd expected pity from him, or worse, the kind of interest that desperate men showed toward vulnerable women. Instead, he'd offered practical help with the same matter-of-fact manner one might use to discuss the weather. It was oddly comforting. Clara opened her valise, checking the damage from the rain. Her spare dress was damp but salvageable, her sewing kit intact in its oiled cloth wrapping. At the bottom, wrapped in waxed paper, were the corn cakes misses. Hartley had pressed on her at the station in Philadelphia for the journey dear. They were soggy now, inedible. She set them aside and found what she was looking for, her father's compass, still in its brass case. Always know which way you're headed, Clara girl. He'd told her before his last voyage, even when the storms come, even when you can't see the stars, the needle always finds true north. She clicked it open now, watching the needle swing and settle. North. Luke Rawlins' cabin was north of town. He'd said, she wondered what kind of man chose isolation over community, then remembered his words about the Shoshone land and Harold's schemes. A man with principles, then How rare. From the far stall came a soft whinny, despite Luke's warning. Curiosity drew her toward the sound. The mare stood in the lamplight, a pretty sorrel with a white blaze down her face. Buttercup, an absurd name for a horse in this rough country. "Hello, beautiful," Clara said softly. The mare's ears pricked forward, but she didn't seem aggressive. "Are you as contrary as your owner?" She extended her hand slowly, letting the horse catch her scent. Buttercup snuffled at her fingers, then pushed her soft nose into Clara's palm, clearly hoping for treats. "I'm sorry, I don't have anything for you." Clara stroked the white blaze gently. "Though I suppose we're both beggars now. Aren't we taking shelter where we can find it?" The mare lipped at her sleeve, and Clara found herself smiling for the first time since arriving in Dustmere. There was something honest about animals. They didn't care about social standing or marriage prospects or whether a woman spoke her mind too freely. She returned to the stove, settling on the bench with one of the blankets around her shoulders. The tack room Luke had indicated looked warm and safe enough, but she wasn't ready for sleep. Too much had happened. Too much had changed. This morning she'd been Clara Langley, respectable if somewhat scandalous daughter of a Philadelphia merchant. Now she was, what, Harold's rejected bride, another failed frontier woman. No. Luke Rollins had been right about one thing: she had skills. Her father had taught her his business before consumption took him, and she'd run his affairs for 6 months while he lay dying, keeping it secret so his creditors wouldn't circle like vultures. She could manage accounts, write a clear hand, and yes, she could sew anything that needed mending. The question was whether Dustmere would let her use those skills. Thunder rolled overhead, rattling the stable walls. Clara pulled the blanket tighter and tried to imagine tomorrow. She could take Harold's money, board the stage, return east to... What her aunt had made it clear she'd worn out her welcome. The gossip about James Hartford's broken engagement had closed most doors in Philadelphia society. At least here she was unknown beyond tonight's humiliation. She thought of Luke's weathered face, the way his dark eyes had assessed her without judgment. He'd been cavalry, he'd said, before whatever had happened with the Shoshone land. There was a story there, probably one that explained his exile to a cabin outside town. But he hadn't seemed bitter, just careful, like a man who'd learned to pick his battles. The stable door rattled in the wind, and Clara started. But it was just the storm, not someone coming to drive her out into the night. She forced herself to relax, to think practically. She had $17 sewn into her corset, her emergency fund that Harold wasn't supposed to know about. That might buy a week's lodging if she could find someone willing to rent to her. A week to prove she could earn her keep. Her sewing kit was good quality, a gift from her mother before she died. Clara had made her own dresses since she was 14, had mended sails on her father's ships when money was tight and the sailmakers were dear. Surely a frontier town needed someone who could patch and mend and make things last. The mare whinnied again, and Clara rose to check on her. Buttercup seemed restless, pawing at the straw in her stall. "Storm bothering you too?" Clara asked. "I know the feeling." She noticed the horse's water bucket was nearly empty. Without thinking, she picked it up and looked around for a pump or water barrel. She found both near the door, a barrel of water with a thin layer of ice on top and a wooden bucket beside it. Clara broke the ice with the bucket handle and filled Buttercup's water. The simple act of caring for the animal calmed something in her. This she could do small, necessary tasks that made a difference. It didn't matter that she was a rejected bride or a social embarrassment. The horse needed water, so she provided it. Back at the stove, Clara finally felt tired enough to seek the tack room. It was as Luke had described, small but clean, with a narrow cot and more blankets. The stovepipe ran through one corner, radiating steady heat. She barred the door from inside, more from habit than fear, and changed into her spare dress, hanging the wet one on a peg to dry, lying on the cot, listening to the storm batter the stable walls. Clara thought about her father's compass, true north. Maybe that's what she needed to find here, not Harold Dunn's approval or the town's acceptance, but her own direction. Luke Rawlins had chosen his path, apparently, living outside town, helping where he could but not beholden to anyone's expectations. There was dignity in that, even if it was lonely. But Clara didn't want to be alone. She'd been alone since her father died. Really, her aunt had taken her in from duty, not love. Philadelphia society had tolerated her until she'd proven too unconventional for their tastes. Even Harold had wanted her only as long as she'd fit his idea of a proper frontier wife. Maybe that's what she needed to build here, not acceptance on others' terms, but her own place, carved out through work and determination. Let them gossip about Harold's rejected bride. She'd be too busy to care. The wind howled louder, and somewhere in the night, she heard wood crash against wood, a loose shutter or fence post giving way to the storm. But inside the stable, she was warm and dry and safe. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight she had shelter and the unexpected kindness of a stranger who asked for nothing in return. Clara closed her eyes, one hand on her father's compass beneath her pillow. True north. She'd find it, one way or another, and maybe, just maybe, Dustmere would be where she finally stopped running from other people's expectations and started building something of her own. The last thing she heard before sleep took her was Buttercup's contented munching of hay and the steady drum of rain on the roof, sounds of life continuing despite the storm, promises that morning would come regardless of the darkness now. In his cabin 2 miles north, Luke Rawlins lay awake, wondering if Clara Langley would still be there when he checked the stable at dawn. He hoped so, though he couldn't say why. There was something about her, that straight spine in the face of humiliation, that flash of humor when he'd warned her about Buttercup, that suggested she might be one of the rare ones who didn't let the frontier break them. Time would tell. It always did. Dawn came gray and cold to Dustmere, the storm having blown itself out sometime before first light. Clara woke to the sound of horses stirring in their stalls and the creak of the stable door opening. She dressed quickly in her now dry clothes, pinning her hair back as best she could without a proper mirror. Luke Rawlins stood by the stove when she emerged from the tack room, adding wood to the dying coals. He glanced up at her approach, a slight nod of acknowledgement. "Morning, Miss Langley. Sleep all right?" "Better than I expected. Thank you." She smoothed her skirts, aware of how rumpled she must look. "I should find proper lodging today. You've been more than kind." "Mrs. Brennan runs a boarding house on Elm Street. She's particular about her tenants, but she's fair." He straightened, brushing wood dust from his hands. "You decided against the stage. Then—" Clara lifted her chin. "I've never been one to run from a challenge, Mr. Rawlins." A ghost of a smile touched his weathered face. "Dustmere will give you plenty of those." He pulled something from his coat pocket, a folded piece of paper. "Map of the main streets. Marked the boarding house and a few other places that might be useful." She took the paper, surprised by the thoughtfulness. His handwriting was neat, precise, not what she'd expected from a cowboy's hands. "You drew this?" "Had some time last night. Storm kept me awake." He moved toward the door. "I'll be working at the Johnson's ranch today, but I'll check in this evening, see how you're settling." After he left, Clara studied the map. He'd marked Mrs. Brennan's boarding house, but also the general store, the post office, and, interestingly, a small building labeled Old Druggist Shop. Empty. She folded the map carefully and tucked it into her pocket alongside her father's compass. The morning air bit sharp and clean after the storm. Main Street was a mess of mud and scattered debris, but already shopkeepers were out sweeping their stoops and setting their stores to rights. More than a few paused to stare as Clara made her way down the street, her valise in hand and her head held high. Mrs. Brennan's boarding house sat on a side street, a 2-story clapboard building with lace curtains in the windows and a painted sign that read, "Respectable lodgings for discerning guests." Clara knocked at the front door, steeling herself for rejection. The woman who answered was tall and spare, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes like chips of flint. She looked Clara up and down with the assessing gaze of someone who'd learned to judge character quickly. "You'd be Harold Dunn's disappointment," she said flatly. "Heard about that." Heat flooded Clara's cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm Clara Langley, and I'm looking for a room. I can pay a week in advance." "Can you now, Mrs.?" Brennan stepped aside. "Come in, then. We'll discuss terms." The parlor was spotlessly clean, furnished with worn but well-maintained pieces. "Mrs." Brennan gestured to a chair and took her own seat across from Clara. "I run a respectable house, Miss Langley. No men above the first floor, no liquor, no loud behavior. Breakfast at 7, supper at 6. You miss a meal, you don't eat. Rent's $3 a week, paid in advance. That includes meals and weekly laundry." "Those terms are acceptable." Clara reached for her purse. "But Mrs." Brennan held up a hand. "Not finished. I don't tolerate gossip or troublemaking. You want to make a spectacle of yourself over Harold Dunn. You'll do it elsewhere." "I have no intention of making a spectacle of myself, Mrs. Brennan. I intend to work." The older woman's eyes sharpened. "Work at what not many opportunities for ladies in Dustmere." Clara thought of Luke's map, the empty druggist shop. "I'm an accomplished seamstress. I thought I might offer mending and alterations, perhaps dressmaking, if there's call for it." Mrs. Brennan studied her for a long moment. "Sarah Abernathy does the mending for most folks, but she's getting on in years. Hands aren't as steady as they were, and there's always women wanting something finer than what Milligan stocks in his store." She stood abruptly. "Room's at the top of the stairs, second door on the right. You can have it for $2.50 a week if you'll help with the household mending. I've got 6 regular boarders, and they're hard on their clothes." Clara blinked at the unexpected discount. "That's very generous." "It's practical. I need the help. You need to save your money to get started. We both benefit." "Mrs." Brennan led the way upstairs. "One more thing, Luke Rollins vouched for you." "He... what?" "Came by early this morning, said you were respectable and deserved a chance." She opened the door to a small but clean room with a narrow bed, washstand, and chair. "Luke doesn't speak for many people. The fact he spoke for you carries weight." Clara set down her valise, emotion tightening her throat. "I'll endeavor to prove his faith justified." "Mrs." Brennan snorted. "You talk like a schoolteacher. That'll have to change if you want folks to trust you with their clothes. Now, breakfast is in 20 minutes. Don't be late." Clara washed her face and hands, changed into her best remaining dress, a practical brown wool that had survived the journey relatively unscathed, and repinned her hair. When she descended to the dining room, she found 5 other boarders already at table, 2 railroad workers, a clerk from the bank, an elderly man who introduced himself as Professor Cartwright, and a young woman named Della who worked at Milligan's store. They all stared when she entered. But Mrs. Brennan's sharp, "Mind your manners," had them returning to their porridge. Clara took the empty seat beside Della, who gave her a sympathetic smile. "Don't mind them," Della whispered. "They're just curious. Harold Dunn's been bragging for weeks about his bride from back east." After breakfast, Clara set out to explore the town properly. The sun had emerged, turning the mud to a sticky morass that clung to her boots. She made her way to the empty druggist shop Luke had marked on his map. It sat between the barber shop and a small cafe, its windows dusty but intact. Peering through the glass, she could see shelves along the walls and a long counter. It was smaller than she'd hoped, but larger than she'd feared. The location was good visible from Main Street, but not so prominent as to seem presumptuous. "It's been empty near 2 years." Clara turned to find a portly man in a barber's apron watching her from the neighboring doorway. "The owner?" she asked. Old Doc Henley. Died of apoplexy. His son back in Missouri owns it now but hasn't been able to sell. Might rent it for the right price. The barber, she could see Josiah's barbershop painted on his window, studied her with friendly curiosity. "You're the lady came in on yesterday's train."
Clara Langley.
She offered her hand, which he shook after wiping his own on his apron.
"I'm a seamstress, looking for a place to set up shop."
Josiah Winters. His face creased in thought. "You know, my wife was just complaining about needing a new Sunday dress. Sarah Abernathy's eyes aren't what they were, and ordering from the catalog's always a gamble. I'd be happy to speak with your wife once I'm established. Tell you what, I'll send a message to young Henley. See what he'd take for rent. Least I can do for a new neighbor." He winked. "Besides, anyone who's got Harold Dunn tied in knots can't be all bad." Clara spent the rest of the morning visiting the shops Luke had marked, introducing herself with a mixture of confidence and humility that seemed to puzzle the shopkeepers. She wasn't cowering in shame over Harold's rejection, but neither was she bitter or defensive. At Milligan's, she purchased a card of needles and new thread, and inquired about fabric prices. "Most ladies order from the catalog, Mr." Milligan informed her, his tone suggesting he didn't quite consider her a lady anymore. "Though I stock basic cottons and woolens. I'll keep that in mind." She paid for her purchases, ignoring his disapproving stare. Outside, she nearly collided with Luke Rollins. He steadied her with a hand on her elbow, then quickly released her. "Miss Langley, finding your way all right?" "Thanks to your map, yes." She hesitated, then added, "Mrs. Brennan said you spoke for me. Thank you." He shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Told the truth, nothing more." He glanced at her package from Milligan's, setting up shop. "Hoping to. Josiah Winters is inquiring about the empty druggist store. Good location. Josiah's a talker, but he's honest." Luke shifted his weight, and she noticed he was favoring his left leg slightly. "I've got some shirts that need mending. Ranch works hard on clothes. I'd pay fair wages for good work. I'd be happy to help once I'm established." He touched the brim of his hat. "I'll be by in a few days. Then, good luck, Miss Langley." She watched him walk away, his slight limp more noticeable now. A cavalry injury, perhaps, or something more recent. She realized how little she knew about the man who'd shown her such unexpected kindness. Back at the boarding house, Clara found Mrs. Brennan had already set aside a pile of mending. She spent the afternoon working through it, her needle flying through familiar motions. Professor Cartwright's coat had a torn pocket. Della's petticoat needed a new hem, and one of the railroad workers had somehow managed to split his shirt from collar to tail. As she worked, Clara felt something settle in her chest. This was what she knew, what she was good at. Let Harold Dunn and his cronies gossip. She had work to do, a roof over her head, and the beginnings of a plan. That evening at supper, Della chattered about the day's customers while the men discussed railroad expansion and local politics. Clara listened, learning the rhythms and concerns of her new home. When Professor Cartwright complimented the neat repair to his coat, she felt a small glow of satisfaction. Later, in her room, Clara pulled out her father's compass and watched the needle find true north. She was far from Philadelphia, far from everything familiar, but perhaps that was what she'd needed all along, a place where she could build something new, something entirely her own. Tomorrow she'd see about the shop rental, start spreading word about her services. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing in Dustmere would be but for the first time in months. Clara felt like she was moving forward instead of simply running away. 3 weeks had passed since Clara opened her small shop in the old druggist building. The rent was reasonable. Young Henley had been eager for any income from the property, and she'd spent her first days scrubbing years of dust from every surface. Now, bolts of fabric lined the shelves where medicine bottles once stood, and her sewing table occupied the space behind the counter. Business came slowly at first. Josiah's wife had been her first customer, ordering a Sunday dress in navy wool. Then came a few repairs-torn trousers, split seams, buttons to be replaced. Nothing grand, but enough to keep her hands busy and coins trickling into her cash box. This morning, Clara was pressing a shirt collar when the shop bell chimed. She looked up to find 3 women entering Mrs. Harold Dunn, Mrs. Abigail Foster, the banker's wife, and Mrs. Constance Whitley, who ran the hotel with her husband, the Trinity of Dustmere Society. Della had called them, warning Clara they could make or break a business with their approval.
Ladies,
Clara said evenly, setting down her iron.
how may I help you?
Mrs. Dunn, a blonde woman with a pinched face and expensive clothes, swept her gaze around the shop with obvious disdain. We heard you were setting up a business.
A sewing and tailoring shop, yes.
Clara kept her tone pleasant despite the way Mrs. Dunn said business like it was something distasteful.
How enterprising.
Mrs. Foster, older and rounder than her companions, fingered a bolt of cotton, though one wonders at the propriety of it. A single woman, living alone, conducting business with men.
I take orders and measurements in full view of the street. Clara said, everything is entirely proper.
Mrs. Whitley, thin and sharp-featured, spoke up. We've heard you've been taking in work from the ranches, mending for the cowboys and such. I mend clothes for anyone who needs it and can pay for it, including Luke Rollins, Mrs. Dunn said, and there was something venomous in her tone. That troublemaker has been seen entering your shop. Clara's hand stilled on the fabric. In the 3 weeks since opening, Luke had brought her several shirts to mend, always during business hours, always maintaining careful distance. He paid promptly and spoke little, though she'd caught him once running his fingers over a particularly neat patch job with something like approval. Mr. Rollins is a customer, nothing more. Mr. Rollins, Mrs. Foster sniffed, is barely civilized. A man who chooses to live like a hermit, who defied the law. Who prevented your husbands from stealing Shoshone land? Clara said quietly. The 3 women stared at her in shock. Mrs. Dunn recovered first, her face flushing red. How dare you? I dare because it's true. Clara lifted her chin. I may be new to Dustmere, but I'm not deaf. I've heard the stories. Your husband wanted timber rights on treaty land. Mrs. Dunn, Mr. Rollins stopped him. If that makes him a troublemaker in your eyes, then perhaps your eyes need examining. You're just like he said. Mrs. Dunn hissed. Too proud, too outspoken. No wonder he threw you over. The words stung, but Clara had endured worse these past weeks. If being thrown over means I'm free to speak truth and earn my own living, then I'm grateful for it. Now, unless you ladies need something sewn or mended, I have work to do. They left in a rustle of skirts and outraged whispers. Clara's hands shook as she returned to her pressing, but she felt oddly exhilarated. She'd drawn a line, chosen a side. There would be consequences, but at least she'd stood for something. The consequences came swiftly. By afternoon, 2 customers had canceled orders. Mrs. Patterson from the bakery came to apologize in person. I'm sorry, dear, but Mrs. Foster holds my husband's loan. I can't afford to cross her. The older woman looked genuinely distressed. It's not right, but that's how things work here. Clara forced a smile. I understand. Thank you for telling me yourself. As the afternoon wore on, with no new customers, Clara tried not to calculate how long her savings would last. She was altering the hem on Della's church dress. At least her fellow boarders remained loyal when the bell chimed again. Luke Rollins filled the doorway, his presence somehow making the small shop feel smaller. He removed his hat, revealing hair that needed cutting. Miss Langley, heard you had some visitors today. News travels fast. She kept her attention on her stitching, not trusting herself to meet his eyes. "I suppose the whole town knows I insulted the finest ladies of Dustmere?" "Pretty much." He moved closer, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "Also heard you defended me. You didn't need to do that." "They were spreading lies. I don't like lies." "They were spreading their version of truth. That's different." He set a bundle on the counter. "Brought these trail works coming up, and I'll need sturdy clothes." She looked at the bundle, 3 shirts and 2 pairs of trousers, all showing hardware. It was more work than he'd brought before, and she suspected he didn't really need it all done at once. "You don't have to." "Not charity." He cut her off. "I pay for what I need, same as always. Just happens I need it now." Clara finally looked up at him. His dark eyes were steady, calm. "They'll talk more if you keep coming here. Mrs. Dunn already implied." "Let them imply." He shrugged. "I've been the town pariah for 2 years. I'm used to it. You're not." "I'm learning." She managed a wry smile. "Though I seem to be a quick study in making enemies." "Better to make honest enemies than false friends." He gestured to the bundle. 2 weeks enough time. No rush if you've got other work." They both knew she didn't, but Clara appreciated the pretense. 2 weeks is fine." He turned to go, then paused at the door. "There's a barn dance Saturday next. Whole town usually goes." "I doubt I'd be welcome." "That's exactly why you should go." He settled his hat back on his head. "Show them they can't run you off with whispers and cold shoulders. Besides, dancing's one thing this town does well." After he left, Clara examined the clothes he'd brought. The shirts were indeed worn, but the trousers looked nearly new. She shook her head at his transparent attempt to help. Even as warmth bloomed in her chest, Luke Rollins was a puzzle, gruff and distant one moment, unexpectedly kind the next. That evening at the boarding house, news of her confrontation had clearly spread. The railroad workers avoided her eyes at dinner, and even Professor Cartwright seemed subdued. Only Della remained friendly, though worried. "You shouldn't have challenged them," she said as they cleared the dishes. "Those 3 women control half the business in town through their husbands." "And the other half?" Clara asked. "Some's independent, like Josiah. Some's too small to matter, and some—" Della lowered her voice. "Some's waiting to see which way the wind blows." Clara spent the evening in her room, working on Luke's shirts by lamplight. Each careful stitch felt like defiance, each neat repair a small victory against those who would see her fail. She thought of her father, how he'd fought to keep his business afloat even as illness consumed him. He'd taught her that work had dignity, that earning your own way meant never having to bow to anyone's prejudices. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Mrs." Brennan entered without waiting for permission, closing the door behind her. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," the older woman said without preamble. "I'm aware." "Are you Mrs.?" Brennan sat on the room's only chair. "Those women can make your life miserable. They've done it before to others who cross them." "Then why haven't they driven out Luke Rollins?" "Because Luke don't care what they think. Also, he's useful. Knows horses better than anyone in 3 counties. Works harder than men half his age. They hate him, but they need him." She fixed Clara with a stern look. "You're not needed yet. You're just convenient to hate." Clara set down her sewing. "Are you asking me to leave?" "Lord, no, Mrs." Brennan snorted. "About time someone stood up to those harpies. I'm just warning you, it'll get worse before it gets better. If it gets better." "Do you think I was wrong to defend Mr. Rollins?" The older woman was quiet for a moment. "Luke came here full of ideals about justice and protecting folks who couldn't protect themselves. The army broke him of some of that, and the town tried to break the rest, but he held on to enough to make him inconvenient to men like Harold Dunn." She stood to leave. "You've got spine, girl. Question is whether you've got staying power." After she left, Clara returned to her sewing, but her mind wandered. She thought of Luke's slight limp, the way he held himself apart from others. What had it cost him to stand against the powerful men of Dustmere? And why was he helping her now, when association with her could only bring more trouble? Outside her window, the town settled into evening quiet. Somewhere, Mrs. Dunn and her allies were probably planning their next move against the upstart seamstress who didn't know her place. But here in her small room, with honest work in her hands and a roof over her head, Clara felt oddly at peace. She'd chosen her side. Now she just had to prove she could hold it. The news came to Clara on a bitterly cold Tuesday morning. Young Tommy Morrison, who helped at the telegraph office, burst into her shop just after she'd opened, his freckled face flushed with excitement and worry. "Miss Clara, there's been an accident up at Devil's Pass. Mr. Luke's hurt bad. His horse went down on the ice, and he got caught underneath when they slid." Clara's scissors clattered to the floor.
How bad?
"Doc Hartwell's gone up, but it's a ways out, and the snow's coming down hard. They're bringing him to the old hunter's cabin at Miller's Creek. That's closest to where it happened." She was already reaching for her coat.
How long ago?
"Maybe 2 hours." Jim Bailey rode in fast as he could. Clara's mind raced. The cabin at Miller's Creek, she knew of it. An abandoned shelter trappers once used, about 5 miles into the hills. In this weather, with snow already falling thick, it would be treacherous going. "Tommy, run to Mrs. Brennan's. Tell her I need medical supplies, bandages, carbolic, anything she has. Then stop at Milligan's for blankets and lamp oil." She pressed coins into his hand.
Hurry!
As the boy ran off, Clara gathered what she could from her shop-clean cloth. Thread for stitching wounds, her sharpest scissors. Her hands shook as she worked, but her mind was clear. Luke had helped her when she needed it. She wouldn't fail him now. Within 20 minutes, she had supplies packed. Josiah from next door had heard the commotion and offered his horse. "She's steady in snow, miss, better than walking." Clara had ridden as a child, though never in conditions like these, but there was no time for doubt. The journey to Miller's Creek took 2 hours through increasingly heavy snow. The trail was barely visible, but Clara followed the fresh tracks of the men who'd gone before. Wind cut through her heaviest cloak like paper, and her fingers grew numb on the reins, but she pressed on. She smelled smoke before she saw the cabin, a low structure built into a hillside, its roof nearly invisible under snow. Horses stood huddled against the lee wall, including Luke's mare Buttercup, who whinnied recognition as Clara dismounted. Inside, she found organized chaos. Doc Hartwell knelt beside a makeshift bed near the fireplace, his instruments laid out on a clean cloth. 3 cowboys stood against the far wall, hats in hands, faces grim, and on the bed. Luke lay still, his face gray as ash, his left leg at an angle that made Clara's stomach turn. "What in blazes, Miss Langley?" Doc Hartwell looked up in surprise. "This is no place for—"
I brought supplies.
Clara cut him off, unpacking her bundle.
And I can help. Tell me what you need.
The doctor studied her for a moment, then nodded. "The leg's broken, bad compound fracture. I've got to set it before infection sets in. Need someone steady to hold him while I work." "She can't," one of the cowboys started, but Clara was already moving to Luke's side. "I'll hold him," she said firmly.
Tell me how.
For the next hour, Clara learned just how strong she could be. She held Luke steady while Doc Hartwell set the bone, cleaned and stitched the gash where it had broken through skin. Luke groaned through the laudanum haze, his hand gripping hers with surprising strength. But he never fully woke. When it was over, his leg was splinted and bandaged. The bleeding stopped. "He's lucky," Doc Hartwell said, washing his hands in melted snow. "Could have been much worse, but he can't be moved. Not in this weather. Someone needs to stay. Keep the fire going. Watch for fever."
I'll stay,
Clara said. The men exchanged glances. Finally, Jim Bailey, the eldest, spoke up. "Miss, that ain't proper. You alone with him?"
Propriety can hang itself. Clara snapped. I'm staying.
Doc Hartwell considered. I need to get back got Mrs. Palmer near her time, and this storm's getting worse. But I'll leave laudanum and instructions.
You've got steady hands and a good head.
Miss Langley.
He could do worse for a nurse.
After they left, promising to return when the storm broke, Clara was alone with Luke in the small cabin. The fire crackled. Wind howled through gaps in the walls, and Luke's breathing was rough but steady. She made herself busy melting snow for water, organizing supplies, checking Luke's bandages. The cabin was sparse but not uncomfortable. Someone had left a store of wood and even some canned goods on a shelf. Clara made a simple soup, though she doubted Luke would wake enough to eat. As darkness fell, the storm intensified. Snow piled against the door, and the wind shrieked like something alive. Clara added wood to the fire and settled in a chair she'd pulled close to Luke's bed. He stirred sometime after midnight, eyes focusing with difficulty.
Clara!
His voice was hoarse, confused. I'm here. She helped him sip water, supporting his head. You had an accident. Your leg's broken, but Doc Hartwell said it. You're going to be fine. He studied her face in the firelight. You came in the storm. You would have done the same. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Stubborn woman.
So I've been told.
She adjusted his blankets, noted his skin felt cooler. No fever yet, thank God.
Rest now.
I'll be here. He caught her hand as she moved to return to her chair. Why? He asked simply. Clara considered the question. Why had she ridden through a blizzard for a man she'd known barely 6 weeks? Why did his injury feel like a weight in her own chest?
Because you saw me as more than Harold Dunn's embarrassment,
she said finally.
Because you helped when you didn't have to.
Because... She paused, then spoke the truth.
Because I couldn't bear the thought of you hurt and alone.
His fingers tightened on hers briefly before sleep took him again. The next 2 days blurred together. The storm raged on, trapping them in their small shelter. Clara dozed in her chair, waking to tend the fire and check Luke's condition. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes lost in fever dreams where he called out names she didn't know, relived moments from his cavalry days. On the second night, his fever spiked. Clara bathed his face with cool water, spooned broth between his lips when he could swallow, and held his hand through the worst of it. He talked in his delirium about a Shoshone village burned, children crying, orders he couldn't follow. She began to understand what had driven him from the army, what haunted him still.
Should have stopped them,
he muttered, thrashing weakly. Should have...
Shh,
Clara soothed, stroking his forehead.
You did what you could. Rest now.
Sometime near dawn, the fever broke. Luke's eyes opened, clear and aware. Clara. Not a question this time, just her name, spoken with something like wonder.
I'm here.
She was exhausted, her dress wrinkled beyond repair, her hair falling from its pins, but the relief of seeing him lucid made her feel light as air. How do you feel? Like a mountain fell on me. He tried to shift and winced.
How long? 2 days. The storm's still bad, but your fever's gone.
She helped him drink water, noted with satisfaction that his hand was steadier. Are you hungry? Some. He caught her wrist gently as she turned away. Clara, what you did was no more than you did for me. She met his eyes steadily. We help each other. That's what decent people do. Most decent people don't risk their lives in blizzards. Then perhaps I'm not decent people, she smiled, trying to lighten the moment. Mrs. Dunn certainly doesn't think so. Mrs. Dunn's a fool. His expression turned serious. You could have died getting here.
But I didn't, and neither did you.
She squeezed his hand.
Now stop arguing and let me heat some soup. You need to eat.
As she worked at the small stove, Clara felt Luke watching her. When she turned back with the soup, his expression was unreadable. No one's ever... He stopped, started again. I'm not used to people staying. Clara thought of all the ways people had left her parents dead. Society turned its back. Harold's cruel rejection. But she'd stayed. And here, in this snowbound cabin with this complicated man who'd shown her unexpected kindness, she felt more at home than she had in months. Well, she said softly, helping him sit up enough to eat. Perhaps it's time you got used to it. The storm would break eventually. They'd return to town, to gossip and judgment and all the complications of their separate lives. But for now, in the warm circle of firelight with snow sealing them away from the world, something had shifted between them. Not love, not yet, but possibility, understanding, a connection forged in hardship and trust. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough. The morning of the third day dawned clear and cold, sunlight glittering on fresh snow like scattered diamonds. Clara woke in her chair to find Luke watching her, his color much improved. Storms passed, he said quietly. She stretched, wincing at the knots in her back. They'll come for us soon. Then... Clara! He started to speak, then stopped, frustration crossing his face. When we get back to town... I know. She busied herself checking his bandages, not meeting his eyes. The talk will be vicious. A single woman spending 3 days alone with a man. I won't have your reputation ruined because you saved my life. My reputation was ruined the moment Harold rejected me. She managed a wry smile. At least this time it's for something worthwhile. Before he could respond, they heard horses approaching. Through the frosted window, Clara saw Doc Hartwell's buggy and several riders, including Jim Bailey and Josiah Winters. Her heart sank a little. Back to reality. The door burst open, bringing cold air and concerned voices. Doc Hartwell went straight to Luke, checking his leg with professional efficiency. Good work, Miss Langley. No sign of infection. Fever's gone. You may have saved his leg, if not his life. She did what was needed, Luke said firmly, his eyes on the other men. Nothing more, nothing less. Josiah cleared his throat. Still, folks are talking. Mrs. Dunn's been having fits, saying it proves what kind of woman. Josiah. Luke's voice held warning. Any man who questions Miss Langley's honor will answer to me. Make that clear in town. An awkward silence fell. Finally, Jim Bailey spoke up. We brought the sledge for you. Luke, Doc says you can be moved now. Getting Luke onto the sledge was a careful operation. He gritted his teeth against the pain, but made no sound. Clara gathered their few supplies, trying not to think about how empty the cabin looked without his presence filling it. I'll ride with Miss Langley. Josiah announced, make sure she gets back safe. The journey back to Dustmere felt both too long and too short. Josiah chattered about town news, clearly trying to distract her from what awaited. But Clara barely heard him. Her mind kept returning to those 3 days Luke's fevered confessions, the way he'd said her name, the strange intimacy of caring for someone so completely. As they entered town, curtains twitched at windows. People emerged from shops to stare. By the time they reached the boarding house, a small crowd had gathered. Mrs. Dunn stood at the front, her face twisted with righteous indignation. There she is, bold as brass, without a hint of shame. Clara dismounted slowly, squaring her shoulders. I have nothing to be ashamed of, Mrs. Dunn. 3 days alone with a man, everyone knows what. Everyone knows I saved his life. Clara's voice rang clear in the cold air. Or would you have preferred Luke Rollins die alone in that cabin because helping him might cause gossip? Don't you dare take that tone with me. You're nothing but a woman who does what's necessary. Mrs. Brennan appeared in the boarding house doorway, arms crossed. Same as I did when my husband lay dying and the doctor couldn't come for 2 days. Same as Martha Washington did when she pulled 3 miners from a cave-in. proper or not. That's different. Mrs. Foster protested, joining the fray. Those were emergencies. So was this. Doc Hartwell had arrived, looking tired and irritated. That man would have died without care. Miss Langley provided it with skill and dedication. Anyone suggesting otherwise is a fool. The crowd stirred uneasily. Clara saw faces she recognized, some hostile, some uncertain, a few sympathetic. Then movement at the back caught her eye. Luke, despite his injury, had insisted on being brought to Main Street instead of straight home. He sat propped in Jim Bailey's wagon, his face pale but determined. "I've got something to say." His voice carried despite its weakness. "Clara Langley saved my life. She risked her own to do it. Any man or woman who speaks against her character speaks against mine, and unlike Miss Langley, I'm not too civilized to settle matters with my fists when I'm healed." "You're in no position to threaten anyone. Rollins." Harold Dunn had appeared beside his wife. "And your defense only confirms what kind of woman she is." "Yes," Luke said steadily. "It confirms she's brave, skilled, and compassionate, which is more than can be said for those standing here spreading poison." Clara felt tears prick her eyes but refused to let them fall. "Not here, not in front of these people. I have work to do," she said quietly. "If anyone needs sewing or mending done by a woman of questionable character, you know where to find me." She walked through the crowd, which parted reluctantly. Behind her, arguments erupted, some defending her, others condemning, most just enjoying the drama. Clara kept walking until she reached her shop, where she locked the door and finally let herself cry. An hour later, a knock interrupted her solitude. She opened the door to find Professor Cartwright from the boarding house. "Miss Langley." He tipped his hat. "I have a coat that needs mending. Several, actually. And I believe Mrs. Patterson mentioned she'd like to resume her order, if you're willing." Mrs. Patterson. But her husband's loan. Ah, yes. Interesting thing about that. Seems Mr. Foster had some irregularities in his bookkeeping. Nothing criminal, mind you, but enough that he's being very careful about calling in loans just now. The professor's eyes twinkled. Small towns have many secrets. Miss Langley. Sometimes they balance each other out. Over the next days, Clara found her shop busier than ever. Not everyone misses. Dunn's faction remained firmly opposed, but enough. Working men brought torn clothes, ranchers' wives ordered new dresses, and even some of the more proper ladies found reasons to need her services. Luke she didn't see, though she heard he was recovering at his cabin. She understood why he stayed away. His presence would only fuel more gossip, but she missed him with an ache that surprised her. A week after the rescue, she was closing the shop when Buttercup appeared at her window, Luke in the saddle. He dismounted carefully, leaning on a crutch Jim Bailey had fashioned. "You shouldn't be riding," Clara said, opening the door. "Needed to see you." He limped inside, lowering himself onto the chair she kept for customers. "Wanted to thank you proper." "You already did, in front of the whole town." "That was defense, not thanks." He reached into his coat, pulling out a small wrapped package. "This is thanks." Inside was a compass, silver where hers was brass, with her initials engraved on the cover. Clara's throat tightened. "Luke, I can't." "You told me once your father gave you a compass, said to always know which way you're headed." He met her eyes. "Figured you should have one that points true in more ways than one." She opened it, watching the needle swing and settle, north, toward his cabin. She realized, toward him. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Clara." His voice was rough. "What happened in that cabin, what you did?" "Changed things," she finished. "I know. I'm not an easy man. I've got ghosts, and I don't fit well in town society. But if you're willing—" "I'm willing," she said softly. "To what? We'll figure out as we go." He smiled then,
The first full smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his weathered face, making him look younger, lighter. "I reckon that's enough for now," he said. Outside, snow began to fall again, but gentle this time. Inside Clara's shop, warmed by the stove and something more, two people who'd found each other in the storm began to map a future together, one careful step at a time. Spring came slowly to Dustmere, melting snow revealing muddy streets and the first green shoots of hope. Clara's shop had survived the winter, her reputation evolving from scandalous to respected through sheer persistence and quality work. The compass Luke had given her sat on her work table, a constant reminder of their growing connection. She was adjusting the hem on a wedding dress when Della burst through the door, eyes bright with excitement. "Clara, have you heard the church is planning a spring social next week? Dancing, food, the whole town invited." Clara's needle paused. The last time she'd attended a town gathering had been shortly after arriving, and the memory still stung. "I doubt my presence would be welcome." "Nonsense. Even Mrs. Patterson says you should come. Besides," Della lowered her voice, "Luke Rawlins told Jim Bailey he might attend if his legs healed enough." Heat rose in Clara's cheeks over the past months. Luke had become a regular visitor to her shop, bringing work that didn't always need doing and staying to talk over tea. Their friendship had deepened into something neither quite dared name, constrained by the watchful eyes of the town and their own cautious hearts. "I'll consider it," Clara said, returning to her stitching. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Harold Dunn stood in her doorway, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable. Clara's first instinct was to close the door in his face, but curiosity won. "Mr. Dunn, how may I help you?" "Miss Langley," he cleared his throat. "I've come to... That is, I wanted to speak with you about a business matter." She gestured him inside, maintaining careful distance. "Business?" "Yes, my wife." He paused, clearly struggling. "She's in a family way. The doctor says she needs to take care, avoid strain. She's asked me to commission some garments, comfortable things for the coming months." Clara studied him, noting the genuine worry in his eyes. Whatever else Harold was, he apparently cared for his wife. "I see. And she sent you here." "Not exactly." He shifted his weight. "She doesn't know I've come, but Martha misses. Washington says you do the finest work in town, and I want Eleanor to have the best." The irony wasn't lost on Clara. The man who'd rejected her so cruelly now stood in her shop, asking for help. She could refuse, could savor this small revenge, but that would make her no better than him. "I'll need measurements," she said professionally. "Perhaps Mrs. Dunn could visit when she feels able." Relief flickered across his face. "You'll do it then." "I'll make clothes for any woman who needs them. Mr. Dunn, your wife's condition takes precedence over our past differences." He nodded awkwardly. Thank you, and Miss Langley, I owe you an apology. What I said, it was ungentlemanly." Clara waited, but he offered nothing more. No explanation, no real acknowledgement of the harm he'd caused. Still, for Harold Dunn, even this much was significant. "I'll expect Mrs. Dunn within the week," she said, effectively dismissing him. After he left, Clara sat heavily on her work stool. The encounter had shaken her more than expected, not from lingering hurt that had faded, but from the realization of how much had changed. 6 months ago, Harold's rejection had seemed like the end of everything. Now it felt like a distant storm that had blown her to where she needed to be. That evening, Luke appeared at closing time. His limp was barely noticeable now, though he still favored the leg in bad weather. He'd taken to timing his visits for day's end, when they could talk without the pressure of other customers. "Heard Harold came by," he said without preamble. "News travels fast." Clara locked the cash box, avoiding his eyes. "He wants me to make clothes for his wife." "And you agreed?"
She's with child. Luke, whatever happened between Harold and me, she doesn't deserve to suffer for it. He moved closer, and she caught the scent of leather and wood smoke that always clung to him. That's very generous of you. It's practical. His money spends as well as anyone's. She finally met his gaze. Are you really planning to attend the social? A slight smile tugged at his mouth. Jim's been pestering me about it. Says I've become even more of a hermit than before. And have you? Maybe. He picked up the compass from her table, running his thumb over the engraving. Been thinking, though. Might be time to stop hiding. You never struck me as someone who hides. There's different kinds of hiding. Clara, his voice dropped low. Man can hide behind anger, behind distance, can tell himself he's protecting others when really he's protecting himself. The air between them seemed to thicken. Clara found herself holding her breath, waiting. Would you go with me? He asked suddenly. To the social? Together. The word came out as barely a whisper. Together. He set down the compass, turning to face her fully. I'm tired of pretending we're just friends. Clara, tired of visiting only for mending I don't need. If you're willing, I'd like to court you proper, in front of everyone. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. The talk. Let them talk. They will, anyway. He took her hands, his calloused fingers gentle around hers. Question is, do you care what they say? She thought of all the whispers, the cold shoulders, the careful distance even friendly folks maintained. Then she thought of Luke's steady presence these past months, the way he listened when she talked, the quiet strength he offered without demanding anything in return. No, she said firmly. I don't care what they say. His smile widened, transforming his usually serious face. Then you'll go with me. Yes. He squeezed her hands before releasing them, stepping back to proper distance. I'll call for you at 7 on Saturday. Wear something you can dance in. You dance. Badly. His eyes glinted with rare humor, but enthusiastically. After he left, Clara stood in her empty shop, hands pressed to her warm cheeks. Courtship, public acknowledgement. It would unleash fresh gossip, might cost her some customers, but the thought of dancing in Luke's arms, of claiming their connection openly, made her feel brave and reckless and alive. She spent the next days altering one of her better dresses, a deep blue silk she'd made in Philadelphia and never worn. As she worked, customers came and went, some offering sly comments about Luke's visits, others genuinely pleased at the news that had somehow already spread. Even Mrs. Dunn came, pale and nervous, allowing Clara to take her measurements with professional efficiency. Neither woman mentioned Harold's visit or the past, focusing instead on practical matters of fabric and fit. Saturday arrived crisp and clear. Clara dressed carefully, pinning her hair in a softer style than usual. When Luke knocked at precisely 7, Mrs. Brennan answered before Clara could reach the door. About time, the landlady said bluntly. You two have been dancing around each other for months. Luke stood in the doorway, clean-shaven and wearing what must be his best shirt, one Clara had mended twice. His eyes widened slightly when he saw her. You look... He paused, then simply offered his arm. Shall we? The church hall glowed with lanterns, filled with the sound of fiddle music and laughter. Conversation stuttered as they entered together, all eyes turning to watch Dustmere's most unlikely couple. Clara lifted her chin, meeting the stares steadily. Beside her, Luke stood solid and unmoving, a bulwark against the whispers. Then Josiah Winters called out, About time you showed up. Rollins, my wife's been saving you both seats. The tension broke. People returned to their conversations, though many still watched with curious eyes. Luke guided Clara to where the Winters sat with other friendly faces, Doc Hartwell, Martha Washington, even Professor Cartwright looking dapper in an ancient evening coat. Miss Clara, you look lovely, Martha said warmly.
That color suits you." As the evening progressed, Clara found herself relaxing. Luke was indeed an enthusiastic if imperfect dancer, but his genuine enjoyment was infectious. They stumbled through a reel, managed a passable waltz, and laughed when they completely botched a schottische. "I warned you," he said, steadying her after a particularly ungraceful turn. "You did." She was breathless, happy, uncaring that Mrs. Foster watched with pursed lips from across the room. "Though I think your boots might disagree with my assessment of the damage. Your toes will recover." His hand at her waist pulled her slightly closer than strictly proper. "Clara, I need to tell you something." The music changed to something slower, sweeter. Other couples moved around them, but Clara felt suspended in a private moment. "I'm not good with words," Luke continued. "Never have been. But these past months, having you in my life, it's changed things. Changed me." "Luke, let me finish." His dark eyes held hers intently. "I know I'm not what you probably imagined. Not successful like Harold, not social or easy. But I can promise you this, I'll always be honest with you. Always respect you. Always stand beside you. No matter what this town or any other throws at us." Clara's throat tightened with emotion. Around them, the social continued music and laughter and the ordinary joy of community. But in their small circle of lantern light, something profound was happening. "I don't want Harold," she said softly. "I never really did. I wanted security, respectability, a place to belong. But you've taught me something better, that belonging to yourself matters more than belonging to society." "Is that a yes to my courting?" "That's a yes to whatever comes next." She smiled through tears that threatened to fall. "North, south, east, or west, as long as it's together." He spun her gently, and she caught sight of their reflection in the dark window, a tall man and a determined woman. Unlikely and perfect in their imperfection, tomorrow would bring fresh challenges, new gossip, the ongoing work of building a life in a town that didn't quite know what to make of them. But tonight, there was music and dancing and the solid warmth of Luke's hand in hers. It was enough. It was everything. The afternoon sky had turned an ominous green-gray when Clara noticed the first drops of rain against her shop window. She'd been working on Mrs. Dunn's maternity clothes, the irony of the situation not lost on her as she carefully stitched garments for the woman who'd tried so hard to ruin her. Thunder rolled across the valley like a freight train. Clara set aside her sewing and moved to the window, watching folks hurry for cover as the drops became a downpour. Spring storms in Dustmere could be violent, washing out roads and turning streets into rivers. The shop door burst open, bell jangling wildly. Della stumbled in, soaked despite the short distance from Milligan's store. "Clara, there's been trouble at the church social committee meeting. Mrs. Dunn and Mrs. Foster were arguing about the summer bazaar funds, and then Harold and Mayor Whitley got involved, and..." She paused for breath. "Luke was there delivering lumber for the new pews. He defended you when Mrs. Foster said something nasty, and Harold challenged him, and now they're talking about settling it outside." Clara's blood ran cold. "Luke's still recovering from his leg injury. He can't..." "That's what Doc Hartwell said. But you know men and their pride." Della wrung water from her skirts. "Jim Bailey's trying to calm things down, but the whole town's watching now." Clara grabbed her shawl, not caring about the rain. "Where?" "Behind the church." "Clara, wait." But Clara was already running, her boots splashing through rapidly forming puddles. The rain came down in sheets now, turning the world into a blur of water and mud. She could hear voices before she rounded the church corner, angry shouts mixing with the storm's fury. A crowd had gathered despite the weather, forming a rough circle. In the center stood Luke and Harold, both soaked to the skin. Harold's face was red with rage, while Luke stood calm but tense, favoring his injured leg. "Hide behind a woman's skirts,"
Harold was shouting. First you interfere with legitimate business. Now you're courting my cast-offs. Careful. Done. Luke's voice was deadly quiet. Your wife's reputation survives because Clara's been gracious enough to help her. Don't test that generosity. You threaten me. You're nothing but a broken-down soldier who couldn't follow orders. Clara pushed through the crowd. Stop this! Both men turned. Harold's sneer deepened, but Luke's expression softened with concern. Clara, you shouldn't be here. Neither should you. She stepped between them, rain streaming down her face. This is foolishness. Harold, go home to your pregnant wife. Luke, you'll damage your leg permanent if you fight. Listen to your woman, Rollins. Harold spat. Though we all know she's good at nursing injured men. 3 days alone in that cabin? Luke moved faster than Clara thought possible with his injury. Not to strike Harold, but to step past Clara, putting himself between her and the crowd. Finish that sentence, he said softly. An injured leg or no, I'll make you regret it. Luke, no! Clara grabbed his arm. He's not worth it. None of this is worth it. She's right. A new voice cut through the tension. Mayor Whitley stepped forward, water dripping from his dignified mustache. This is disgraceful. Harold, Luke, you're grown men, not schoolboys. And in this weather, you're likely to catch pneumonia before you can land a punch. He insulted, Harold started. You insulted yourself, the mayor interrupted. Acting like a jealous fool when your wife needs you home. As for Mr. Rollins, he's shown more restraint than you deserve. Mrs. Dunn appeared at the edge of the crowd, pale and trembling, supported by Mrs. Patterson. Harold, please, come home. For a moment, Harold's face showed something almost human concern for his wife, perhaps shame at his behavior. Then his pride reasserted itself. This isn't over, Rollins. It is. Luke's voice held finality. You made your choice when you rejected Clara. Live with it, and let the rest of us live in peace. The crowd began to disperse, folks remembering they were standing in a torrential downpour. Harold helped his wife toward their buggy, while others scattered to find shelter. Soon only Clara and Luke remained, rain pounding around them. Your leg, Clara said, noticing how heavily he leaned to one side. You've hurt it again. Worth it. He cupped her face in his hands, rain slick and gentle. Nobody talks about you that way. Nobody. I've heard worse. It doesn't matter. It matters to me. His thumbs traced her cheekbones. You matter to me. Standing there in the storm, soaked and shivering. Clara felt something shift inside her chest. All the careful boundaries they'd maintained, the proper distance, the cautious courtship, it all seemed suddenly foolish in the face of this raw truth. Luke, I love you. The words came out fierce, urgent. I know it's too soon to say. No, I should court you proper for months yet, but Clara, She silenced him the only way she could think of, rising on her toes to press her lips to his. He froze for a heartbeat. Then his arms came around her, pulling her against him as the kiss deepened. Rain poured over them. Thunder crashed overhead, and Clara felt like she was flying. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Luke rested his forehead against hers. That was, improper, Clara suggested, a laugh bubbling up. Perfect. He kissed her again, quick and fierce. Absolutely perfect. A throat cleared behind them. They sprang apart to find Reverend Morse standing in the church doorway, a slight smile on his weathered face. If you two are quite finished scandalizing what's left of my congregation, might I suggest you come inside, Mrs. Morse has hot tea, and Luke, that leg needs tending. Embarrassment flooded Clara's face, but Luke just laughed a rich, full sound she'd rarely heard from him. Thank you, Reverend, though I should point out we're courting official now. So I gathered. The Reverend's eyes twinkled. Though perhaps next time you might demonstrate your affections somewhere less public than my churchyard. Inside the parsonage, Mrs. Morse fussed over them with towels and hot tea while Doc Hartwell, who'd been summoned, examined Luke's leg. "You've strained it, but no real damage," the doctor pronounced, "though you're a fool for even considering fighting on it." "Man does foolish things for love," Reverend Morse observed, accepting a cup from his wife. Clara felt her cheeks heat again, but Luke caught her hand under the table, squeezing gently. His message was clear: no shame, no regrets. As the storm began to ease, they prepared to leave. Luke's horse was brought around. He couldn't walk far on the strained leg, while Clara would return to the boarding house on foot. "I'll call tomorrow," Luke promised, standing with difficulty. "If you'll have me. Every day, if you like." She touched his hand briefly. "Though perhaps we should avoid any more public demonstrations for a while." "No promises." His smile was wicked. "You're a hard woman to resist." Clara Langley. Walking back through the settling evening, Clara reflected on the afternoon's events, the confrontation with Harold, the public declaration of feelings. That kiss in the rain, it would be all over town by morning. Mrs. Dunn would be more venomous than ever, despite Clara's kindness with the clothes. But as Clara touched her lips, still feeling the warmth of Luke's kiss despite the cold rain, she couldn't bring herself to care. They'd crossed a line today, claimed each other in front of the whole town. There was no going back now. At the boarding house, the other residents were gathered in the parlor, clearly discussing the afternoon's drama. They fell silent as Clara entered, dripping and disheveled. "Well, Mrs. Brennan said dryly, "I hope you gave as good as you got." "Better," Clara said, head high. "Much better." Della squealed and hugged her despite the wet clothes. Professor Cartwright raised his teacup in salute. Even the railroad workers nodded approval. Later, in her room, Clara unwrapped the compass Luke had given her. The needle pointed steadily north, toward his cabin, toward the life they were building together despite all obstacles. She thought of his face in the rain, fierce with protection and love, of his lips on hers, washing away months of careful distance in a single perfect moment. Tomorrow would bring consequences: gossip, speculation, perhaps lost business. But tonight, Clara Langley was simply a woman in love, kissed thoroughly in a thunderstorm by a man who thought she was worth fighting for. The compass needle quivered, then held steady. True north. She was finally pointed in the right direction, and no storm weather or human would blow her off course again. The storm returned with vengeance as evening fell, darker and fiercer than the afternoon squall. Clara had just finished closing her shop when the wind began to howl, rattling the windows with renewed fury. She'd sent Della home early when the sky first darkened, but now wished she'd accepted the girl's offer to wait out the weather together. Lightning split the sky as Clara struggled to lock the door, her hands shaking not from cold but from the memory of that afternoon's kiss. The whole town was talking. She'd heard the whispers through her shop window, seen the looks both scandalized and approving. But none of it mattered next to the warmth that bloomed in her chest when she thought of Luke's fierce declaration. "Miss Langley." She turned to find Tommy Morrison fighting through the wind, his young face creased with worry. "Tommy, what are you doing out in this?" "It's Mr. Rawlins. Miss, he never made it home. His horse came back to Johnson's ranch without him, and with his leg hurt and this storm." Clara's heart stopped. "How long?" "Maybe 2 hours. The men are getting ready to search. But in this weather," the boy had to shout over the wind, "Jim Bailey said to tell you. Thought you'd want to know." Clara didn't hesitate. "Tell Jim I'm going to check the old shelter where the road forks. Luke mentioned he sometimes stops there when weather turns bad." "Miss, you can't go out in this." But Clara was already moving. She ran to the boarding house, ignoring Mrs. Brennan's protests as she grabbed her heaviest cloak and the medical supplies she'd kept since the cabin incident.
The compass went into her pocket she'd needed if visibility got worse. Within minutes, she was mounted on Josiah's steady mare, the same one she'd ridden to save Luke months ago. The storm seemed personal now, as if testing whether she'd risk everything for him again. The road out of town was a river of mud. Wind drove rain horizontal, stinging her face like needles. But Clara pressed on, trusting the horse's instincts when she could barely see past its ears. Thunder crashed overhead, so loud it seemed to shake the ground. At the fork, she almost missed the shelter, a small lean-to used by travelers, barely visible through the storm. But there, tied to a post and miserable in the rain, stood Luke's horse Samson. "Luke!" Clara dismounted, stumbling through mud that sucked at her boots. "Luke!" She found him inside the shelter, propped against the wall, his face gray with pain. His injured leg was stretched before him at an awkward angle. "Clara!" His voice was thick with confusion. "What are you? How did you—" "Tommy Morrison. Your horse. I knew you'd try to shelter here." She knelt beside him, hands already checking for injury. "What happened?" "Leg gave out when I dismounted. Stupid." He caught her hands. "You shouldn't have come." "The storm." "Would you have stayed safe in town if you'd heard I was missing?" His silence was answer enough. Clara helped him to a more comfortable position, noting how he bit back groans of pain. "I don't think it's broken again," she said after careful examination. "But you've torn something. We need to wait for the storm to ease before moving you." "Clara," he stopped, staring at something past her shoulder. She turned to see what had caught his attention. Through the shelter's opening, lit by near-constant lightning, she could see the storm's full fury. But there was beauty in it too, the way the rain swept across the valley like a living thing. The electric brightness that turned familiar landmarks strange and magical. "It's magnificent," she breathed. "Terrifying," Luke corrected, but his hand found hers. "And magnificent, like someone else I know." Clara turned back to him, ready with a teasing response, but the look in his eyes stopped her. In the strange stormlight, with the rain pounding the shelter's roof and thunder shaking the walls, he looked at her like she was everything. "I keep thinking about this afternoon," he said quietly. "Not the fight with Harold that was foolishness, but after, in the rain." "Luke, I meant what I said. Every word." His fingers tightened on hers. "I know I'm not what you came west looking for. I'm not successful or charming or—" "You're honest," Clara interrupted. "Brave, kind. Though you try to hide it. You see me as I am, not as you wish I was." She touched his face gently. "I didn't come west looking for you, Luke Rawlins, but finding you was worth every hard mile, every cruel word, every moment of doubt." He pulled her closer, and she went willingly, settling beside him in the shelter while the storm raged outside. His arm came around her, solid and warm despite their wet clothes. "When this weather breaks, things will change." Luke set into her hair. "The talk today, it'll make folks take sides. Some will turn meaner. And some will surprise us with kindness." Clara thought of Mrs. Patterson's quiet support, Josiah's friendship, even Mayor Whitley's intervention. "We're not alone. Luke, not anymore." "No," he agreed, "not anymore." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the storm. Clara could feel Luke's breathing, steady and calm despite the pain he must be in. This was what she'd been looking for. She realized, not a grand house or social position, but this someone to weather storms with, literal and figurative. "Tell me about after," she said suddenly. "After we court proper, after you heal, what comes next?" Luke was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about building a bigger cabin. Nothing fancy, but solid. Room for 2, maybe more. In time." Clara's heart skipped. "More?" "If you're willing, if you want." He paused, suddenly uncertain. I shouldn't assume. I want, Clara said firmly. A home, a family, a life built together. She smiled against his shoulder. Though perhaps we should consider living closer to town, for practicality. Or we could bring the town to us, build something worth traveling for. His voice took on a dreaming quality. Maybe a proper horse ranch. You could keep your shop, or work from home if you preferred. We could... A tremendous crack of thunder cut him off. So close the ground trembled. But Clara wasn't afraid. Here in Luke's arms, with plans spinning out between them like gold thread, she felt invincible. The storm began to ease near dawn. Clara had dozed fitfully, waking whenever Luke shifted in pain. As gray light filtered into the shelter, she heard horses approaching. That'll be Jim and the search party, Luke said. You should prepare for more scandal, spending another night alone with me. Let them talk. Clara stood, stretching stiff muscles. I'm done caring what small-minded people think. The rescue party included Jim Bailey, Doc Hartwell, and surprisingly, Mayor Whitley himself. Their faces showed relief at finding Luke safe, though eyebrows raised at Clara's presence. Seems we've got a pattern here, Doc Hartwell said dryly as he examined Luke's leg. Miss Langley rushing into storms to save stubborn cowboys. Someone has to, Clara replied calmly. Though I'd prefer if Mr. Rollins would stop requiring rescue. Fair point, Luke admitted. They got him onto a makeshift stretcher, preparing for the journey back to town. As they emerged from the shelter, Clara gasped. The storm had washed the world clean, leaving everything sparkling in the early light. The mountains stood sharp against a clearing sky, and the air smelled of sage and new beginnings. Back in Dustmere, a small crowd had gathered despite the early hour. Clara saw hostile faces, curious ones, and more friendly ones than she'd expected. Mrs. Brennan stood at the front, arms crossed but eyes warm. I've got the front room ready, she announced. He'll stay there until that leg heals proper. No arguments. As they settled Luke into the boarding house over his protests about propriety, Clara found herself surrounded by unexpected support. Della brought fresh bandages. Professor Cartwright offered his personal library to help pass recovery time, and even some of the railroad workers volunteered to help at Luke's cabin while he was laid up. Later, as Clara sat beside Luke's bed in the parlor, he caught her hand. No more storms, he said firmly. No more rescues. From now on, we face whatever comes together, standing side by side. Together, Clara agreed, then smiled. Though you have to admit, we do seem to find each other in the worst weather. Maybe that's fitting. His thumb traced circles on her palm. We're not fair weather people, Clara Langley. We're storm people. We endure. Through the window, Clara could see the town going about its morning business. Some folks pointedly avoided looking at the boarding house. Others waved or nodded acknowledgement. The battle lines were drawn, but Clara found she didn't care. She had work she loved, people who supported her, and a man who thought she was worth fighting storms for. The compass in her pocket pointed steadily north, but Clara no longer needed to check it. She knew where she belonged now, right here, building a life with equal parts courage and love, facing whatever weather came their way. Luke squeezed her hand, and she squeezed back. Outside, the sun broke through the last of the clouds, painting Dustmere in light. It was going to be a beautiful day. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope Clara and Luke's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it. Where are you listening from? Please leave a comment below and let me know your thoughts on their story. I'd love to hear what moments resonated with you most. If you enjoyed this tale of courage and love in the frontier, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and don't forget to hit that hype button so more people can discover these heartfelt stories from the American West. Until next time, partners.